So, welcome to In Good Faith. My name is Shaun Johnson. I'm a campus minister here at St. Norbert College. We have the privilege of being here with Dr. Wolfgang Grassl, who is an associate professor of business administration at the college. Dr. Grassl has taught at such universities as Oxford University in the United Kingdom, Webster University in his home of Austria, and the University of the West Indies. Dr. Grassl has recently been on sabbatical, where he's done some research as well as has been guest lecturer at the invitation of the Patriarch of Venice to speak before a specialized school of theology and economics. He's published many works on economics and business, or in economics and business, and he's done some research on medieval history as well as some research and publications on the Norbertine order. Thank you again for being here today with us.
Thanks for the invitation, Shaun.
Okay, I think we can go ahead and start with some questions. I'm really interested in the whole thing of you being invited by the Patriarch of Venice to speak at an economic and theology conference. Can you tell us a little bit about that experience and what that invitation was?
Yes, well, it grew out of work that I've been doing over the last 2 years or so for one of the dicasteries, as they're called, within the Vatican, the Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace. Mm-hmm. And that work concerned the role of business in today's society and a theological perspective on business. And through my involvement with that Vatican institution, which made me travel to Rome twice and is still ongoing, I got to know a number of people. So that invitation grew out of that involvement. And it was a conference, an international conference, quite high level, quite small though, with a select number of speakers and presenters in Venice, in a beautiful palace in Venice. And so it was like 2.5 days of a very, very intensive encounter between different positions on the social teachings of the Church.
Okay. And your particular position piece I read a little bit of it, talked about being more.
Yes, this is a phrase that is taken from the most recent papal encyclical, Caritas in Veritate, or Charity in Truth, where the Pope uses that phrase, being more, essere di più in Italian. Mm-hmm. And how can one be more? How can one grow beyond one's limitations? And the idea of the paper was, and of my presentation, which will be published very soon, was that the logic of the Holy Trinity gives us the clue for being more, because it's a very powerful logic for understanding society, because what the Holy Trinity actually means is unity in diversity. Mm-hmm. There are three persons with their different identities, the Father, the Son, and the Spirit, with their different identities and yet the same substance as we believe. And so having the same substance yet different identities gives us, I believe, a clue for even for social policy. And that was the idea that I presented, and that was discussed in Venice.
And one of the things I thought was interesting about this idea of being more as well was the whole idea that society exists for the development of the human being.
Yes.
That's sometimes a radical
yes, it's not
concept.
It's not humans that exist for society. It's not humans that have to fit into the straitjacket of a state or so. All these institutions are there for as the Pope says in his social encyclical, integral human development. So a human development that is not only becoming richer or becoming healthier or something like that, but also growing morally, growing spiritually.
You've done a lot of work in the fields of economics and business, a lot of publications. And one of the things that I was interested about was that you've also done some work in theology.
I wouldn't say in theology, but I take a theological perspective often as a Christian. I take a theological perspective on many issues. And if one goes deeper and tries to understand what we are talking about, even phenomena in marketing or in finance or whatnot, it's very easy to find theological roots and theological questions that are at the base of these issues, and that is what interests me. So I'm much against, although I do some technical work, of course, I do a lot of statistical analyses, empirical surveys and whatnot, but what interests me yet more is to research the connection between philosophy, theology, and social questions, particularly those of business.
One of the things that we talked about the last time we were at Luna was this idea of what you were doing basically or setting up in your sabbatical in research, kind of the fundamental understanding of how markets and how society in general around economics should function. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us a little bit about what that's rooted in? And
yes, I am. My main sabbatical project was, and since it is not completed yet, it is to write a new textbook. A textbook which has a focus on marketing, but which is a very, very non-traditional textbook. The idea is that when we look at the various subdisciplines of business, whether it's finance or human resources or operations management or marketing or even accounting, then these have become so specialized as if they did not have anything to do any longer with the human person. Mm-hmm. So my project is to rethink marketing from the beginning, so to speak. What are we doing when we are in business, when we create products, when we develop new products, when we look for markets, when we try to create value for customers so that they will buy these products, etc., etc. Now, much of the language that we have learned to use over the last 30, 40 years is pretty much artificially created. And as so happens often in academics, if it is repeated for 20 years or 30 years, we believe that there are such things. Mm-hmm. We tend to impute reality to certain things. And I want to start from scratch and say, what are we really doing? So it starts with the theory of the human person and of human actions. And doing that means that I try to integrate questions of ethics already at a very deep level. It's not what is often done in business nowadays. Everything is run as normal, and then you have added on a half an hour consideration of business ethics, which is quite artificial and added on. So I try to integrate questions of ethics at a very deep level because they have to do with what the human person is.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that is interesting in modern society, I think, is that you just said we specialize in certain elements of whether it be economics, business, particular sciences, whatnot. We specialize so much, or we compartmentalize our worlds. So the world of economics doesn't necessarily have conversation with ethics in the sense of our Christian identity. So I think it's kind of an interesting project that you're starting, that whole sense of how do we really look to the foundational element of the development of the human being rather than looking at a market piece or how to sell a project. So that's kind of an interesting perspective, a different way of approaching it.
And it goes much beyond business, of course. I believe that if we look at the academic landscape nowadays, the way we have divvied up disciplines and so on has come about by historical accident often. If you look at the natural sciences, for instance, there's a lot of research going on in biochemistry, which is one discipline, which is also done in organic chemistry, for instance, or in biology or so. So that how we exactly divvy up disciplines is relatively artificial. What interests me, what are the questions? And as a hypothesis, I may throw out there practically all interesting questions of today's life and today's society are dealt with in at least 2, 3, or 4 different disciplines. Mm-hmm. For instance, the question of human nature interests sociologists, psychologists, theologians, philosophers, anthropologists, and probably many others.
You've published a few works on the Norbertine order. I read part of one of the articles. I think it's a selection of a particular collection of works, and then you are releasing a publication, actually an extensive publication very soon, on the Norbertine order. Can you tell us a little bit of what piqued that interest?
Yes, when I came to St. Norbert College, I knew very little about the Norbertines. It so happened that in Austria, where I grew up, there are 3 monasteries of the order, and as a boy in my younger years, we visited these monasteries as a tourist, so I knew about the order, but I knew practically nothing about it. When I came to St. Norbert, I was naturally interested in my new academic environment, and I started to explore, so to speak. And I found that there is relatively little literature. There's a lot of literature on a very specialized aspect, on one particular thinker, or on the strong tradition of Marian devotion in the order in the 14th century in Spain, or something like that. But there is very little towards an overview. So I started to write a book on the culture and the intellectual position of the order. And out of that grew a 668-page book, which was officially released last week. I saw the first copy, but the first copy was sent to me as a correction copy, so I could still read through it and find a couple of printing mistakes and so on. And the book will then be ready for commercial release in about 10 days from now.
Wow.
It's called A Culture of Place.
Okay.
And then it has a subtitle. The notion culture of place seemed to me particularly important and germane to the order, because one of the traits of the order has always been that its various houses have been very independent of each other. So very different from, let's say, the much later Jesuits or other religious communities which were more centralized. This order has always been very decentralized. And it was held together through a common style of devotion, through a common, very Augustinian theology and things like that. But apart from that, they were very much wedded to the respective regions. And as they are here in De Pere, for instance, where they have been an enormous factor in the culture of the Green Bay area, and for a while even in for the economy of the Green Bay area.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I always found that interesting, particularly with this order, because I've worked for different religious orders as well, and that whole idea of they actually use the Latin word localitas.
Yes.
That whole element, and actually we have a retreat or a week-long service trip that goes to different abbeys.
Yes.
That builds on that whole idea of space, that abbey is part of the community in which it's surrounded, and it addresses particularly the needs of that community, and those needs change over time. I just thought that was kind of a really interesting element of the Norbertine order.
And if you look at some of the older monasteries within the order, let's say Strahov in Prague, or some of the German ones, and a number of others, you can trace that back for 700 years or so. So already 700 years they were the school in the region, and they provided educational services, and later on hospital services and whatnot. So these strong local service activities that made me choose that title, Culture of Place.
Now, when you wrote this book, it wasn't all in one language.
No,
there were a lot of different
quite.
texts that you translated. Can you tell us a little bit about
Yes.
the different languages
Well,
that you worked with?
Obviously, if you look, I try to read nearly all the important sources, primary sources. It means books written by Norbertines, or Premonstratensians, as they are called worldwide. But not only books. I also looked at the cultural activities, the music they produced, and the artworks they produced, and very important, the liturgy. there is still a premonstratensian rite that is performed from time to time in some abbeys, and was more frequent, of course, than it is now. And of course, that too is a product of culture. So no, to study that and to look even at the primary sources took a while, and a lot of interlibrary loan activity. Most of these, of course, were in Latin. However, because of the culture of place, the Norbertines actually started to publish in the various languages of the countries relatively early. So I had to consult some works in Czech and in Hungarian and obviously in Dutch and in German and French and Spanish. And that does not include yet the secondary literature. So altogether, the primary and the secondary sources, I think, added up to about 1,200 or so.
Wow. That's quite extensive
So if
research.
the book is not worth anything else, at least it's the largest list of references on the order probably anywhere around.
That's awesome. So as I've gotten to know you a little bit more, Dr. Grassl, I've gotten to know that you haven't always been a practicing Catholic. And when we had our conversation at Luna down the street, you told me a little bit about what brought you back to the church. Can you tell us a little bit about that story? And
Yes, I grew up as a Catholic. I'm so-called cradle Catholic, and I back in Austria, I was an altar server and all that at the time when the Latin Mass was still practiced. So I still remember the old Latin Mass pretty much by heart. But as it happens to many people, when I went to university later on, I fell by the wayside. Mm-hmm. It's not that I was hostile to the church or so, but I lost faith. I succumbed to rational explanations for everything, and that is easy, of course, nowadays. And so I went through life for a long time as somebody who was very interested in Catholicism and in Christianity, but more as an observer, bystander, and in some cases admirer, but not as somebody who's involved. Now, that leaves a lacuna, that leaves a gap in one's life. It was in later years, over the last number of years, that I grew more involved with the Catholic religion again. And the reasons are several. On the one hand, I've always read books of theology and religion and so on. And I've always treasured the strong emphasis on reason in Catholicism. So that was one thing that has piqued my interest. On the other hand, usually if one returns to the faith and if one makes a more serious commitment to it, then that usually has some personal reason too. And the personal reason was for me finding love. And when I met my wife, which is now a number of years back, many things changed in life. And then you start asking yourself, where does that come from? And for most things, you can give a rational answer. It's very difficult to give a rational, scientific answer to where love comes from. And as somebody who is a little bit, at least mathematically minded, I was sitting there and saying, well, what's the opportunity to find such a good match, right? What's the chance? What's the mathematical probability? And the mathematical probability, if you look at all the parameters involved and so on and try to estimate that, is so minute, right? That at some stage you say, well, let me be intellectually honest and let's say there is something else involved. So that was my approach over the years, and it did not happen. There was no conversion or so experience. It was a slow process.
Okay. So it was a slow process coming back. I'd like to talk a little bit about your relationship, if you feel comfortable with that.
Oh, sure.
The first time I met your wife, actually, was here at St. Norbert College. It was my first year of employment here. We were doing an interfaith series with Dr. Holder, Dr. Jeffries, and your wife, Reverend Rebecca Profak, who herself is a Reformed Protestant minister. I just found that interesting because knowing you and knowing some of your perspectives, also knowing your history with theology, all these kinds of things, I could imagine sometimes you might get into some interesting conversations at home.
Oh, we have conversations on a daily basis.
Yeah, I would hope so.
We do theology for breakfast, lunch, and dinner,
of course,
and in various forms. I believe there are different approaches to faith. Even within Catholicism, if you look at the faith of a Saint Thérèse de Lisieux, the Little Flower, it's a very different approach to faith from the faith of the ecstatic faith of St. John of the Cross, or St. Teresa of Avila or so. And the faith of a St. Thomas Aquinas, who was both very religious and very devout, but he was also very rational and a philosopher, right? And tried to combine the two, was yet a different one. So there are different approaches. My approach has always been more the rational one. My wife probably has a much stronger intuitive faith. For her, certain things, certain questions don't even arise because it's clear. For me, I have to find rational answers often. So there are different approaches, and that alone creates for lots of opportunities to talk. And also, Protestants often have a much better knowledge of Scripture than Catholics do, out of tradition. And certainly, whenever I write something and I need a scriptural argument or references and so on, I turn to my wife, because she knows it by heart. She, oh yes, that's the book. Oh no, that's in Joel. And she's a specialist on the Old Testament. So particularly when it comes to the Old Testament, I mean, she probably tells you the chapter and verse without having to look it up.
Nice.
So we get along very well on that, and what is very important, we respect each other's traditions and each other's beliefs, and there are some areas where we will not agree. There are many areas where we actually do agree, but there are many areas also, some at least, where we do not, like the role of the Virgin Mary.
Yeah, I find that interesting. It seems like you have a nice complementary relationship in the whole sense that if there's ever anything that you need scripturally, you can always go to your wife. That's kind of nice. And that whole idea of being able to grow in faith and have different perspectives and respect each other, that's important. That leads me to a question about dialogue nowadays, and it's more of a critique on modern society. I know you've done a lot of work on the basic foundational understandings of how we should be able to grow in faith, grow in respect for each other through looking at the Trinity. Would there be anything that you would particularly say when we talk about dialogue, especially when we come to different perspectives on a particular issue?
Well, I think what we can learn from that model, if I may say so, of the Trinity is that difference is absolutely welcome, but difference should always lead to some form of unity. So it should not lead to division. I think that's so. Quarrel with somebody on some position, but at the end of the day, give that person a handshake and say, I respect your opinion. I hope you can respect mine. And we are both human beings. We are both entitled to having our opinions. We will be civil to each other So you try to establish some form of unity at a different level. I think that is important. And then there is no end actually to the opinions that you can sustain, provided that that's the end of it. It ends in that kind of resolution.
When I think of when we talk about the Catholic intellectual tradition, that kind of underpins much of what we're talking
Absolutely.
about. Is that continual grappling with the bigger questions, also the consultation of other resources that might not be particularly in concert with what our foundational beliefs might be, but might have interesting perspectives to give us some element of truth.
One takes as an example for what you're saying, Shaun, for instance, the famous medieval theologian and philosopher Abelard, who wrote this book, Sic et Non, Yes and No, right? Yes and No, where he tries to trade off, so to speak, absolutely contrasting positions on important questions, and says, well, is there a possibility of finding some kind of resolution? And sometimes there is more and sometimes there is less, right? But this is very much part of that tradition. And Abelard, of course, although he suffered personal misfortune, as we know, in his life and all that, but he was a great member of that Catholic intellectual tradition.
Well, thank you very much for being with us today, and thank you for sitting down and for being willing to share a little bit about your story.
My pleasure.
Thank you.